Hi again. My name is Jehad Abusalim. I'm the Education and Policy Associate with the American Friends Service Committee's Palestine Activism Program based in Chicago. I'm happy to join you all today and thank you for joining those who are tuning in on Facebook. Welcome to this week's special Facebook Live with our honorable guests, who I will introduce in a second. Today is the International Day in Solidarity with the Palestinian people, and I, as a Palestinian and as staff with the American Friends Service Committee, I look to this day as a day in which we remember the people who are fighting on the ground for their freedom, for their dignity, and for their liberation in Palestine, and remember all the peoples who are also struggling and hoping to achieve their liberation and emancipation against all the forces of injustice and oppression in our world. So on this day, on the International Day in Solidarity with the Palestinian people, we are honored to welcome three guests who will talk to us today about one of the most recent assaults on the Palestinian people and on the Palestinian civil society, and on people who are fighting against oppression in Palestine and beyond, against organizations that I will talk about briefly that work for human rights. It is really hard to sum up what happens in a year. So between the last time we celebrated the International Day in Solidarity with the Palestinian people and this day, a lot has happened. We witnessed the brutal attacks on Sheikh Jarrah, on Palestinians in Gaza, and we witnessed growing settlement building, and we witnessed a lot of assault. But to add insult to injury, on October 19, 2021, the Israeli Defense Ministry issued a military order declaring 6 Palestinian civil society organizations to be terrorist organizations, quote unquote. The groups include Addameer, Al-Haq, Defense for Children Palestine, an amazing partner of AFSC, the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, Bisan Center for Research and Development, and the Union of Palestinian Women Committees. Anywhere else in the world, organizations with such names will be received and celebrated, except that in Palestine, they have been designated and as terrorist organizations and have been criminalized by the occupation regime. The designation effectively outlaws the activities of these civil society groups. It authorizes Israeli authorities to close their offices, seize their assets, and arrest and jail their staff and workers. And it prohibits funding or even publicly expressing support for their activities. To talk about this development today, I would like to welcome our three guests, starting with my colleague, Mike Merryman-Lotze, who's the AFSC's Middle East Program Director and who previously worked as a researcher at Al-Haq, one of the criminalized organizations, from 2000 through 2003 during the Second Intifada. And in that capacity, he worked also closely with other targeted organizations, particularly DCI, Addameer, and Bisan. I would like to also welcome my friend and colleague, Brad Parker, who is a senior policy advisor at Defense for Children International Palestine. He specializes in issues of juvenile justice and grave violations against children during armed conflict and leads DCIP's legal advocacy efforts on Palestinian children's rights. He regularly writes and speaks on the situation of Palestinian children, particularly issues involving detention, ill treatment, and torture of child detainees within the Israeli military detention system and violation of international law and international human rights law. He is a co-leader of the No Way to Treat a Child campaign in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, a graduate of the University of Vermont, and received his JD from the City University of New York School of Law. Last but not least, I would like to welcome also my friend and colleague Marya Farah, who is a lawyer who focuses on international human rights law and who previously worked for Al-Haq, again, one of the criminalized organizations, and the International Commission of Jurists, among other organizations. Mike, Brad, and Marya, welcome. And I would like to start, and before I start with the conversation, I would like to invite our audience to submit any questions they have about, that they would like to address to the speakers or the panelists in the chat. And we will make sure to pay attention to your questions and answer them right away. So, Brad, let me begin with you. In your opinion and analysis, what led to the criminalizing of DCIP by Israel? Can you give us a little bit of a historical context on that?
Sure, thanks, Jehad. I mean, the context is, for decades, the Israeli government and sort of aligned and affiliated right-wing civil society organizations have sought to end funding and chill relationships and essentially isolate Palestinian civil society that's working to expose the violations that Palestinians encounter every day under Israeli military occupation. So the latest sort of escalation, it has to be seen in that context. In part, the latest escalation where the Israeli government is moving to actually criminalize organizations like DCI Palestine and Al-Haq and others, it's because previous efforts have not been successful in eliminating and silencing our work. So, I think that's really the main thing I think that's key here, is that this isn't sort of a new one-off thing. It's a continuation of decades of a similar attacks meant to criminalize us and delegitimize the work. And now it's just sort of gone to that next phase of actual criminalization to achieve the goal that's been the goal from the beginning, which is to eliminate the basic human rights monitoring, documentation, legal services work that organizations like DCIP provide.
And how has this recent attack impacted the ability of DCIP to work, especially on the ground, providing documentation about ongoing violations and things like that?
So the main impact, I think, to this moment is just the uncertainty that comes along with the new designations, the complete distraction from the day-to-day work of representing children in the Israeli military court system, providing legal aid to children in the Palestinian juvenile justice system, documenting fatalities, home demolitions, sort of all of the things that are ongoing under Israeli occupation, right? Those are, we're still doing that. We're still carrying out that work. But the threat to staff, potential arrests, the organization shutting down, assets being frozen, all of that just adds a really kind of significant psychological burden at the moment, which at any point feels like it could become an actual obstacle and burden. And so in the immediate sort of aftermath of the designations, I think it's that feeling of how do you overcome this? How do you continue the work despite the overwhelming sort of odds that are now against us? I think the positive piece has been the international sort of solidarity and reactions from policymakers, decision makers, and individuals and groups throughout the world that have really not accepted the designations, right? Or the underlying quote unquote evidence that the Israeli government has based the designations on. So I think that's been a bit reassuring, but at the end of the day, the designations are a significant obstacle to kind of long-term programming and provision of services. So it's in the immediate sort of context, We've been able to continue our work, had a lot of support and people redoubling efforts to support our work. But to some degree, right, if we're successful with this in the moment, then we know that efforts to criminalize us and eliminate our work will escalate. So it's a bit of a pincer at the moment we're in the midst of.
Indeed, and I would like to take this opportunity to call upon our supporters and our audiences to, in response to the doubling down of these measures against Palestinian human rights defenders, to also double down our support and be there for these organizations and provide them with all sorts of support in face of all of these challenges. Marya, you have worked with Al-Haq, one of the organizations that have been unjustly criminalized by the Israeli occupation regime. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with Al-Haq and its contributions over the years for promoting and protecting Palestinian human rights? And why Al-Haq? Why would Israel come after an organization that protects and promotes human rights?
Thanks, Jehad. Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, to put it more into context with Al-Haq in particular, it was founded in 1979, and it's the oldest and first Palestinian human rights organization. And, you know, they're really kind of a typical human rights organization in terms of documenting and monitoring human rights violations across the occupied Palestinian territory. And with their documentation, they then analyze what's happening, not just the violations, but kind of the broader policies and practices of Israel, and produce reports, submissions to UN bodies, and other sorts of advocacy materials. And then they conduct advocacy on this analysis and have meetings with third state representatives, civil society organizations, even groups that are passing through Palestine. So that's one thing that I had done quite frequently, as if there was, let's say, a student group that was traveling to really discuss the situation and have people understand what's going on and kind of try to go beyond the narrative that's being pushed forth by Israel. And to your point with Al-Haq's, I guess, successes in terms of promoting and protecting human rights, you know, first of all of these organizations, like you said in the beginning, they're all very respectable, highly respected, recognized organizations internationally. So this includes receiving international awards for their work. Al-Haq has received numerous awards for their work on business and human rights, to having, you know, support in terms of partnerships and funding. So, you know, the legitimacy of these organizations is really not a question, but in terms of more like the practical contributions, Al-Haq has had a really wide impact in terms of the development of the law, how other organizations, particularly in Palestine, also started their work. And, you know, Al-Haq had done numerous trainings for how to conduct field research, both nationally and regionally. And very early on, in terms of the successes, Al-Haq focused on kind of patterns of violations. So looking at what's happening on kind of the micro level and how Israel is administering these territories, not just at kind of very individual violations, which of course would be impossible given the extensiveness of them by Israel. So looking kind of big picture, and you see as early as the 1980s, where Al-Haq is saying that Israel's settlement enterprise and related actions are going towards permanent annexation. You also have Al-Haq saying that Israel's administration of water and land resources is a situation of de facto apartheid. In the 80s, they held a conference to examine the legal implications of prolonged occupation. And obviously all of these things have continued, but you really see kind of Al-Haq setting the stage for this discourse, which now, I mean, 30 to 40 years later, is starting to become somewhat normalized. And obviously that's very slow, but you see this impact and this kind of continued chipping away at Israel's discourse and really highlighting what's happening. So I think that that's kind of really the biggest impact.
Definitely. Thank you, Marya. I mean, again, Al-Haq and all the other organizations, what we see here is a pattern and a continuation of Israel's measures to undermine international law, to undermine human rights across the board, not only with these 6 organizations, but also, this has been a pattern that Israel has followed for decades, and one can think about what kind of dangerous precedents the Israeli occupation regime is setting by continuing this kind of assault against human rights defenders in a world where human rights have been at risk, whether in the Middle East, in many other countries, we're seeing all these refugees trying to cross, and all of these things. So this is a dangerous moment, universally, globally, for such measures to be taken against human rights defenders. And on that, I would like to invite my colleague at AFSC, Mike Merryman-Lotze, to comment. Mike, you also worked with Al-Haq. You have history working with that organization. Can you share with us what was your first reaction when you heard the news, and you heard about an organization that you personally worked with, an organization with which you had this connection, being accused of quote-unquote terrorism? What did you think?
Yeah, thanks, Jehad, and thanks, Brad and Marya, for what you said. I mean, I think like everybody, I think the immediate reaction was shock. That the idea that these organizations, which are really well-known, well-respected international organizations based in Palestine, organizations with partnerships around the world, with connections to the international community, that they'd be labeled terrorist organizations. I think it was something that was a real surprise. At the same time, as Brad said, this followed decades of attacks on these organizations by the Israeli authorities. So, I mean, as an example, when I started with Al-Haq in 2000, one of the very first things that I worked on was an action alert calling for the release of Dawood Darawe, who was a lawyer at the time with DCI Palestine. He'd been beaten and detained and placed in administrative detention by the Israeli authorities while I was with Al-Haq. The Israeli military invaded all of the Palestinian cities there. They raided the Al-Haq offices. They arrested and placed one of our staff in administrative detention. They raided the Addameer and DCI and the other offices of organizations. Over the time since then, there have been very concerted efforts by the Israeli government with support from nonprofit organizations that have kind of connections to the Israeli government to go after the funding for all of these organizations, falsification of letters alleging misconduct by the organizations that have been, thoroughly audited by the donors and found to be false. There's been attempts to make these same claims of links to terrorist organizations and over the years, and repeatedly those claims have been found to be false. Several of them just in the last year. I think I'm not sure Brad mentioned it, but there were claims in the UK alleging links between the PFLP and DCI Palestine that were found to be libelous. There were attempts to go after the auditing companies to say that the auditors of these organizations had ignored connections between them and these organizations, and those claims against the auditors were found to be groundless. That all of these attempts to smear and label Al-Haq and Addameer and DCI and Bisan and the Union of Agriculture Working Committees and Women's Committees had had failed. And so, in many respects, this was the next step to be taken. If you presented evidence to donor governments and they've all rejected that evidence and said that there is no link here to be found, then the next thing that can be done is to move into the public with that, which to me in many ways is the danger of this move, not just to the Palestinian civil society organizations, but it really speaks to the shrinking of civil society space globally. And that if this is allowed to stand, if the US government doesn't come out against this move, against these Palestinian organizations and the abuse of the counterterrorism efforts, then there's nothing to say that this same type of tactic isn't going to be used against organizations in other places, that this doesn't become a tactic to silence civil society and human rights activists all around the globe. And so it's really, yes, a dangerous move that silences Palestinians as civil society, but it should be something that's of concern to really anybody who's concerned about human rights and accountability in any part of the world.
Thank you, Mike. And given that we're running out of time, quickly, since given how concerning the situation is, as Mike said, Brad, what has the response of members of Congress and the administration has been so far in reaction to this measure by Israel?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been a response from members of Congress. This is, I think, a positive development, which, a few years back, you wouldn't ever be able to say that members of Congress would condemn this decision. But pretty quickly, I think the week after the designations were announced by the Israeli government, a number of members of Congress in the House introduced a resolution. It's House Resolution 751, which condemns the designation and has some strong language in there. So we've been pushing folks to have their members of Congress add their support to that resolution as a statement against the Israeli government's designation of our organizations as terrorist organizations. There was a really strong letter from Representative McGovern condemning the decision and sort of pushing the State Department to take action. From the administration themselves, I know DCI Palestine has had a relationship with the State Department, both on the ground in Palestine and in Washington. We sent multiple requests for meetings since the designations were announced, and there's been no contact there. I think that's still the case for the rest of the organizations as well. So I think the main push at the moment is to have the Biden administration, respond to the allegations and the secret evidence, all of these things that the Israeli government, is sort of saying against us. And so far, they haven't done that, despite the fact that, a lot of the allegations and the sort of evidence against us has been presented to, as Mike said, European governments throughout the past year, and has widely been found to be unsubstantiated and non-credible. So the longer that the US takes to essentially, have a statement one way or the other, it sort of creates a vacuum where other actors can pile on and push this, I think, forward, where the kind of the harms of criminalization from the designations become much more real for people that work at the organizations, and I think for civil society globally. Right, if the U.S. is not willing to condemn the use of terrorism labels against legitimate human rights organizations and civil society organizations, that's incredibly concerning, I think, for a global community of civil society advocates working in a number of different authoritarian contexts. So yeah, that's sort of the update on that front.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And I mean, primarily the effects of these measures taken by the Israeli government will affect human rights workers on the ground, but it's important to let our audience know that the work of these organizations is not necessarily limited to just on the ground. I mean, as AFSC, we have a partnership with Defense for Children International, and on that I would like to ask Mike. A lot of our supporters and the people who are interested in our Palestine-Israel work have been asking about the ways such measures taken by Israel affecting these organizations on the ground, and wondering whether these measures will impact our work here, or whether, in Palestine-Israel as well. If you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that any time that the terrorism label or designation gets put out there, it causes a lot of fear for people. And I think the most important thing to say is that this should not stop anybody from partnering, from supporting, from working with any of the organizations that have been criminalized by the Israeli authorities. That for those of us in the US, this actually should be a time when we are increasing our support for these organizations and standing in solidarity with them. That the Israeli designation and labeling of these organizations has no legal implications for anybody outside of Israel and Palestine. That here in the US, these organizations have not been criminalized, have not been labeled, have not been listed. And so they are still considered organizations that we can all work with and support and partner with without concern. That, as Brad said, the U.S. State Department actually often turns to these organizations for information about the human rights situation in Israel and Palestine. That those connections haven't been severed. And so for anybody who is thinking, well, how does this impact me as somebody who's not in Israel and Palestine, this isn't an action that impacts you directly. This is something that is really being used to try and silence these organizations, to try and cut off the funding to these organizations, to attempt to close them down. There have been statements by Israeli officials that said that the main purpose of this labeling was to cut off sources of funding to these organizations and to try and shut them down through that path. The risk is to the staff of the organizations on the ground who might be arrested or who could face consequences from the Israeli government. But for those of us who are here, in many ways, this kind of criminalization, on the day of solidarity with the Palestinian people, it should be something that calls us into acts of solidarity, to standing with the organizations, to saying that we will continue to support them despite the Israeli labeling, and will continue to lift up the information that they're providing, to lift up the work that they're doing, and to support the efforts that they're making for justice and long-term change.
Thanks, Mike. There is a question from one of the members of the audience that I'm wondering if Marya can answer it. It's from Ronald Mendel, who's asking, how does the attempted criminalization of the 6 Palestinian human rights groups serve the interests of the Israeli government's ethnic cleansing project?
I think it serves it in a number of ways. I mean, I think, first of all, in terms of context, Brad and Mike have said how these organizations have been targeted for a number of years, but I think kind of pulling back a little bit more, Palestinian educational, social, cultural institutions have been targeted by Israel since its founding. And there was one figure, I believe, from a couple of years ago, that in Jerusalem alone, there were about 120 institutions that have been closed by Israel, again, cultural, educational institutions that were Palestinian. And this is kind of in addition to events by different institutions that are closed down. Like at the end of last month, there was supposed to be some sort of cultural event at a church in Jerusalem, a 3-day event, I believe, that was focused on children, that was closed down. So it goes beyond this shrinking of civic space of human rights defenders to this shrinking of space just generally for Palestinians. And Israel generally uses this context, or this pretext, I should say, of security or terrorism to really target Palestinians kind of across the board. And I think that that definitely fits into this grander project of colonization, of ethnic cleansing, annexation, all of these things that are happening for over 70 years. And I think also kind of beyond that context, how it fits in also is this overarching theme of impunity. So as it targets these organizations, as Brad has said also, it is definitely going to affect the work of the organizations and their work towards accountability. So to continue this ethnic cleansing project. So we would see that, of course, like with the continued work with the ICC that maybe Brad can speak more about. But, you know, Israel has historically not allowed in individuals, let's say, from the UN for fact-finding missions or special rapporteurs. So these organizations are really critical to giving information for these different mechanisms that should be holding Israel accountable. It's more than likely that Israel is not going to let in any sort of investigation team from the ICC. So if these organizations are closed down, how is this information going to be transmitted? What kind of impacts is it going to have on accountability, which again, we haven't really seen that much of generally, but you know, that is also obviously tied into this continuing project of cleansing and colonization.
Thank you, Marya. I would like to end with this question. There was another question from our colleague John about a response from the Biden administration, which I believe Brad has addressed so far. And okay, we thank you so much for all this great analysis, you know, helping us understand this decision, its implications, and so on and so forth. I think the best way to conclude this conversation is to talk about moving forward. And moving forward matters because we are, you know, we hope to inspire action and cultivate people's efforts to not only to challenge this decision, but to also proactively continue working, despite the odds of these distractions that are created regularly, to focus on the real issues. So the question for you all: what is needed moving forward? Whoever wants to go first.
So I think in the broadest sense, liberation for Palestinians living under Israeli control and full rights, right? I think that's the goal, and that's the thing that you know, eliminates much of what the repression is meant to address. So you know, we'll keep seeing repressive tactics against civil society, against Palestinians, closure of Gaza. You know, these are the practices and tactics to silence and just deny basic rights to people as a means to control population, right? And I think this is the realization that Israel is an apartheid regime. It's an authoritarian regime that denies rights to the majority of people under their control. If you look at all of the different areas that Israel controls, right, that's the reality. So I think that reality is becoming more visible, and this, I think, tactic and essentially repressive act is just another example of how the Israeli government has become increasingly authoritarian. not just in a sort of occupation context, but sort of holistically under kind of all areas that they exert control. So I think that's kind of, you know, the big piece. I think in the narrow piece for what people can do, right? If you've had experiences with the organizations, if you visited Palestine, if you've met with our colleagues at Al-Haq, at DCI, at Addameer, right? Those experiences are part of what is being criminalized here and trying to be repressed. The goal of the designations is to chill that relationship so that you don't go to Palestine and you don't have those experiences and you don't see ultimately what Israeli policies mean for Palestinians on the ground. So we've been asking folks to, you know, share those experiences publicly with their family, whatever it is that they feel comfortable to do. Like, talk about your experience, right? I think at the end of the day, whether the organizations continue to exist in the same form or not, right? Ultimately, it's about exposing the violations and crimes that are happening on the ground and working to end those. And by sharing your experience, sharing what you've seen, that's really a very individualized, personal way that you can be part of essentially pushing back against these designations and pushing back against exactly what they're meant to chill.
Thank you, Brad. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at where we are today as a solidarity movement outside, and look at where we were, say, 10 or 20 years ago, there's been enormous changes that have happened during that period. Just in the last year, really, I think there have been some really significant shifts that are showing how acceptance of kind of Palestinian rights is increasing on the international stage. You had the Human Rights Watch report noting that Israel is an apartheid state. You had Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Hamokat, coming out and saying that the situation in Palestine is one of apartheid. You have legislation now that's been repeatedly put in place at, you know, in the U.S. calling attention to abuses of the rights of Palestinian children, initiated by DCI. You have the International Criminal Court just this year saying that they're going to start to investigate human rights abuses and war crimes and violations of rights in the context of Palestine, and that's largely based on the work of Al-Haq and Addameer and other organizations. All of these shifts are really shifts that have happened based on the dedicated work and long advocacy of these organizations. That the effort to change and shift narrative is something that they've all pushed forward, and it's been successful. And you have to see that the pushback against these organizations, criminalization of them, is in some ways a product of that success. There's a fear that's coming as narrative shift, as people's acceptance of the reality of apartheid increases, as BDS efforts gain ground internationally. And so I think that as we're thinking about how do we move forward, it in many ways is just continuing to push for social and political change, educating the people who we know about what's happening on the ground, while continuing to reach out to elected officials and supporting efforts to push for political change that demands respect for Palestinian rights, while lifting up the work of these organizations and demanding protection for their staff and work as we move forward. But continuing to lift up these organizations and their work and the message of what they're doing, and seeing that as a push for justice that needs to continue.
Thank you, Mike. Marya?
Yeah, I mean, I think just echoing what's already been said, I think that people should write about their experiences, contact their local, state, national authorities, let them know what's happening, contact their media, whether it's national or local newspapers, let them know what's happening. I think that the case of Palestine is so incredibly well documented, and there's no reason to not know what's actually and accurately happening there. And, you know, every day we see new videos of settler violence, of home demolitions. These are not really on the US kind of corporate media pages. And these are things that we have to make sure that they're going to start to be represented there. So I'm, you know, very encouraging of continuing to write in these different spaces and say, you know, this is happening. It can't be that we're continuing to hide what's happening there, or, you know, create a false narrative of what's happening there. So I would say definitely writing, and then also, you know, issues related to BDS, boycott, whether that's kind of you in your individual capacity and your purchasing power, to you as an investor, to businesses that are looking towards their corporate social responsibility policies. I mean, I think that there's a place for everybody in the struggle to do something and to move the ball forward in some way.
Thank you, Marya. So with this, I think our conversation today comes to an end, but our work won't. And this is always a feature of all these conversations about Palestine. We start a conversation and we comment about what's happening, and what really matters is the last part, right? Like to move forward, you know, equipped with this knowledge, equipped with the belief that we are on the right side of history, and we are doing our work, and we continue this work against all the odds, against all the challenges, and against all these things that are meant to slow us down and to make us, keep us distant from the end that we seek, that is liberation, dignity, and freedom for Palestinians. So I'm really thankful and grateful on behalf of myself and my colleagues at AFSC for your input, for your analysis, and for your presence today. Thank you so much for joining us and for your time. And I would like to urge our audience, members of our audience, to check out all the resources that my colleagues have been providing on the chat, the articles, the campaigns, the petitions, and most importantly, the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, which DCI Palestine and AFSC have been working together to push in the United States, has been a fundamental campaign that has pushed for a lot of change. So I invite people to check the campaign out and support it in whatever ways they can. Marya, Brad, and Mike, thank you so much for joining us today, and يعطيكم العافية. Great job, and we'll invite you here soon to celebrate more wins. Thank you so much.